Welcome back to Equity in Focus. I'm your host, Kevin Hooks. Today, we're venturing into the heart of justice, community, and transformation with a guest who embodies the spirit of resilience and advocacy. Dr. Patrick Graham is a dedicated warrior in the realms of housing, talent development, and the fight for the wrongly accused. He joins us to share his journey and his insight. Dr. Graham, his work has illuminated paths to justice in dark places, and we're honored to have you here to discuss the layers of your impactful journey. So thank you for joining us today, and welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me, my brother. It's good to see you. Good to be here.
Yeah, likewise. So listen, before we get started, tell the audience, who's Dr. Patrick Graham?
I'll tell you that one way I describe myself is someone who grew up on hip hop and grits. Uh, I actually grew up in Long Island, but my mother and many of the surrounding community were actually first generation migrants during the Great Migration from the South to the North. And so I always wear that with pride that I'm a Northerner with these Southern roots. Um, but I'm also one who believes that at the end of every rainbow of equity, of every fight for equality, it must be some notion of justice. We must have a result of justice. And so, if anything, I'll say that I'm a justice fighter across all sectors.
No, I love that. And for the audience, Patrick and I met many moons ago when we both served the Urban League as
Right.
CEOs, young CEOs, really trying to make our way in this whole fight for justice. So, it's good to reconnect. And you've touched all kinds of different areas of the socioeconomic justice rung. You've been in many critical areas in the fight. Talk about like what inspired you to get into this work and the many places you've stopped along the way.
Well, I think that one is, like many people, your beginnings also help shape what your path will be, though it doesn't actually literally dictate it all. And I had a mother who was a very intelligent woman. She was an advocate for actually housing for youth. She started many youth programs up in Long Island. She was a Southern migrant, and I was actually inspired actually by many of the young people at the time in my community who to me at the time seemed old, but they were actually young. When your mom is, 27, with my brother and I, you think of her as old at that point. She's actually a young person.
Yes.
Right? And so there were a lot of people like her. I had a young lady who was my Sunday school teacher, Kathy Williams, who was part of the Economic Opportunity Commission. I had a gentleman across the street, Raymond mentioned Sr., who was the assistant executive director of the Nassau County Youth Board, Nassau County in Long Island. And I had all of these other people who were fighting for different types of justice, but they were all from the South, like my mom, living in this northern place. And so I got to actually see them really struggle to provide opportunities in our community, a very segregated community, old school segregation by race. So the other thing that I was able to see, working class folks, men who are dressed in their greens and blues, on the garbage trucks or working in sanitation, to, some who would actually be in a suit catching the Long Island Railroad to New York. So I actually had a real good view of hardworking African Americans trying to make a community for themselves. It inspired me forever. I would say that my white whale has become poverty and economic opportunity.
Wow. And that is such an important area to really focus on, there's an African saying about sticks in a bundle being unbreakable.
Yeah.
Talk about the support of, who do you bring to bear, as a part of your team to fight against these challenges our community faces?
Well, outside of the individuals I mentioned and how they shape me, I actually look for good kindred spirits. I have a gentleman now, many people know me more now for affordable housing development. And here in North Carolina, we have probably what's called We Build Concord, one of the most flexible models that many have seen. I've actually had people from HUD tell me that.
Mm.
And the guy is named J.C. McKenzie. He is a guy who says that he's somewhat of a progressive redneck. and
Yeah.
And I said, what you begin to do is you begin to find different people across areas. So he's definitely one of them who is, definitely been in my corner and supportive on this new journey around housing equity and affordable housing and development. I would also say, I've had past people who have stood by my side. One of my mentors actually was a young lady, Carol Hardison, when I first came to back to Charlotte. And sort of led emergency financial assistance here for mortgages and utilities under her. I mean, she's been a great mentor and always been by my side. So I think that is those type of people. I still have Miss Kathy Williams who calls me man. It probably uses some choice words, probably more than most, but I tell you, but definitely a woman of God. And after I lost my mom, she was one of those who definitely stayed in contact with me because she remembers, when I was a young kid, man, sometimes you're running in the street and she would be there with my mom waiting for me to come home. So, I
Yeah.
mean, these type of people, both past and present, I lean on them.
Yeah. Really quickly, it's Women's History Month. And I feel like a through line in everything you've talked about was the importance women have had on shaping you and continue to have today.
Oh, yeah.
Expand on that a little bit for us.
But, what's interesting too is that growing up the way I did, my mom, one of her best friends was a woman named Mary Traxler, and I love Mary Traxler. She was from South Carolina, had migrated up during the 50s up to New York. And she became my godmother. Back then, younger women like my mom at the time, she was only 16 when she migrated, right? Graduated high school, migrated at the age of 16 in the 60s. And I remember my godmother telling me that, she was the prettiest brown thing she saw step off the train, and they became friends from there, right? And so here I had this woman who liked a little taste now and then, you know what I'm saying? But still would make sure that we were safe and all right? So I had this extended family. And I remember that she actually is one of those outside of my mom who showed me what unconditional love looked like.
Yeah.
And so I just think that I had aunts who had also migrated there. I remember my Aunt Alice, for example, being just one of the most kind women there is, and watching her go through her struggles. And I always thought of her in a metaphoric way, because I remember she used to make sweet potato pies and literally would take them out with her hands so delicately, like without anything on them, right? Like how you even have fingertips.
Mm-hmm.
And when she would do that, it symbolized to me the care that she had even through troubled times. So all of these women, really were part of a legacy for me, and really showed me what unconditional love was like. I had, other issues too coming up, just like anyone else. I had some women that I met who actually were predators as I was a young man. I talked to a lot of people about that, a lot of our young boys, and how to watch out for that. So I had really these sort of conflicting images, man. I had these women who gave me unconditional love, those that I would say, let's praise the unfamous women. And
Yes.
then there were those at times, just like men, who didn't show up in the brightest ways in your life.
Yeah, let's keep on this theme of unconditional love, because I know that this, your fight against, false accusation is something that is really personal to you, and it's something that you are really on the front lines of. But I know that during your experience, talk about the value of people loving you unconditionally and being willing to see you.
Yeah, so what's interesting is when I went through a false accusation case for assault, what was difficult at that time is that there was a child in my arms and I was being attacked. And because I threatened to call the police, the assailant one called the police, and it snowballed. And if it wasn't for a tape that actually showed that this didn't actually happen, which wasn't revealed right off. I mean, we got this thing about a week before trial. It's what exonerated me. But what it made me realize is how easy it is. No one interviewed me. No one talked to me. So I said, can I imagine now how many people, right, go through these type of battles who don't have resource? Right now, there are over 114,000 people, according to various university studies, that are actually incarcerated who are falsely accused. And they may either have plead out of fear or something else happened. And with most of these, that 40% of all false accusation cases, actually, there's no crime committed at all.
Wow.
And this is the tragedy of it all. And so I began to study more and realize, my God, I'm not alone in this, but not only not alone, I've got a lot of company. And unfortunately, 50% of those falsely accused in our country are Black men. And what makes that unfortunate is that we're less than 7% of the population. So we have to actually now have some laws that actually punish people for making false accusations. Many times they simply walk away, someone apologizes to you, or you have to go fight for your rights or restitution civilly, and these people just walk away. And I think that that's part of the problem. We just haven't made it truly illegal. We say it's illegal on paper, but we don't actually put any teeth into it. And I think that that's one of the things that outside of housing and talent and workforce development justice, that I want to see justice for these, because I feel that many people who are in the criminal reform business miss this very important segment of the population. We don't focus on them. We simply just let them handle it themselves. And it's actually, you start to see more energy. Groups like the Innocence Project, the Exoneration Project, all of these other entities. Now you start to see it. But what I want to see is more civil rights organizations step up and deal with the issue.
What do you say to individuals or groups who conflate, the fight against false accusations with devaluing or invalidating the cries of the truly victim people that experience true crimes like that? What do you say when they try to conflate the two? Because it's two separate conversations.
They are and they're not. I'm going to tell you one thing is that false accusation victims are true victims of a crime. So let's start there.
Thank you for that clarification. I really appreciate that.
They are victims of a
Thank you
crime,
for
right?
that. Yes.
And they're real victims. And I think that's part of it, right?
Yes.
I think the other is that they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, we can, chew gum and walk at the same time. No one says that any victim of any crime, right, shouldn't get justice, including false accusation victims.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, no one says that people should just be falsely accused.
Right.
We're not talking about someone like Emmett Till, who was falsely accused and over 50 years ago. But we're talking about since 2017, and these are just exonerations. Exonerations have increased by 70%. I mean, you got to think about what we're talking about. These are not old cases. Some of them are very recent cases.
Yeah.
And if you put on top of that, those who are falsely accused who either get exonerated and don't have to go through the process of conviction, like myself and others, right? Yeah. We're still part of this group that gets stigmatized until we have to overly prove who we are. I remember my assailant had some victims who had some people with her who advocated. And then as they found and discovered evidence, as some of the judges began to whisper in the chambers, two of them who even wrote a recommendation for that person to be in their organization, an organization that I admire, by the way, came up to my wife and I and literally apologized in public.
Wow.
And I think that for me, that's something I had to really sort of grasp, that I had to also now give grace, as hard as that is.
Mm.
My mother, in one of the letters to me about it, said, I know that you have a right to be angry, but I want you to consider your child and all of these things that can impact her if you move forward with suing your assailant. And that was very hard. And I had to make a promise to her, something that you've seen in an article, where very difficult thing to do.
Mm.
But I loved the woman for who she was. And so that became very hard to break. And it becomes even harder that I have to still deal with these individuals and talk to them and be kind,
Yeah.
right? And all of these things. And I'm going to tell you, and I'll just say it's very personal, but most people who commit false accusations are they're either trying to protect themselves from something, right? In this case, she was trying to protect herself from getting arrested. Two, a lot of times there's some narcissistic behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it so many times. As a matter of fact, in my case, this young lady, even after all of this and with no relationship at all, as I was getting ready to get married, asked me, would I consider maybe not getting married or not being engaged and be with her, and we could lay low for a while before we come out. I mean, literally said that. I've had that on tape, so I mean, there's no one could deny it.
Right.
And I just said, how could you think that that's possible?
Mm-hmm.
And then it dawned on me that she wasn't living in reality. And this is a very accomplished individual.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of what we have to do a deeper dive into is, number one, laws that protect victims of false accusation.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, also looking at what are some of the mental issues or other things that drive some people to do it.
It's interesting, like that you talk about the laws, like, what does justice look like in a scenario, particularly like yours, where you go through this process, it's almost impossible to ever be made whole. And then you also know you have to sort of heal from it as well, which sometimes does mean not pursuing all, opportunities that you have to adjudicate the situation. What does justice look like?
I think justice looks different for everyone, right? And I'll say, because justice for me was that I was able at some point to come to myself, get on my feet, and just say, I refuse to let a false accusation define my whole life's work. There are people here in Charlotte, for example, that are still using some of the tools or programs that came from this brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore I just said no, right? That's one. Two is that I realized too that for me, justice was now about how do I ensure that there are policies, strategies that we can engage in that prevent this from happening to others. Because at the end of the day, I mean, it's like thinking about, my uncle, father, others served in the military, Vietnam and Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And the thought for them was you never leave a man on the beach.
Yeah.
And that's the way I felt about this. Now I'm like, okay, look, I was strong enough just to get up and walk away, and through resilience, just refuse to be. And so that resilience over time allows you to find some grace for others, right? But there are others who that doesn't always happen to. And I'll give you a perfect example, man. There was a young man accused of a rape he didn't commit. And eventually it's found that this person lied. And so he was exonerated. But as he was exonerated, he talked about how he didn't even want his children to have his name because he didn't want them to have the shame of it. To me, justice is that person who did that to him does the time they prescribed for him.
Mm. Mm. Wow. So, and I agree, I don't have any words, and I'm rarely at a loss for words for the way it must feel, particularly for a father to be not want their children to have their name. That to me is unthinkable. But that being
I
said,
mean,
What do you say? What do you say to the people who know that they're being falsely accused? And what's the best strategies to defend themselves? And then stick to the fight because in our community, we're so accustomed to being in front of a DA or a prosecutor and going, you get a choice between 20 years or some probation or 2 year. I can't take my chances in a court that's stacked against me anyway.
Well, I'm gonna be honest. Once I got that tape, I mean, there was instant relief because now I'm like, well, this is gonna be over, and it was. I mean, there were women in there who were disgusted when they could hear me being hit, etc., through the whole thing, and that they could hear me even trying to reason with her.
Yes.
And when they realized I had a child in my hand, it really sort of changed some things in that room. But by then, the damage is done, right? But I will say that if you are finding yourself in that predicament, number one, you have to really find some people that you trust and know, and really try to look and get hold of evidence to try to defend yourself, even before the lawyer themselves. Because I'm going to tell you, even with that, you have to be careful. What I found in these systems is that lawyers, these judges, sometimes, especially in certain communities, very incestuous. They actually all know each other. They raise money for each other. They shoot. I had the two that were originally involved in my case went to law school together. I mean, these are very difficult things. So how do you actually have a system that can really protect someone objectively when you have all these connections between you? And there were a couple of them judges who were involved with this were actually members of the same organization as the assailant, so there was all of this going at the same time. And here I am, known as Dr. Patrick Graham, the guy who, resurrected the Urban League, the guy who led the workforce board, Charlotte Works, to new heights, and gave them a value system that they didn't have before. All of these things. And yet it meant nothing. Because you know what happened? I was still a black man. And I was caught in the stereotypical thoughts around issues of assault, domestic violence. 1 in 3 women, according to some stats, will experience it, but also it says that 1 in 3 men will.
Wow.
Now, the difference is that we have to watch and really protect women because death rates in those cases are higher. And so I'm not going to walk away from that. I said, you got to deal with that. But on the other hand, too, there has to be a place for men like myself and others that when they're assaulted, when they're attacked, when they're abused, where do you go? Who actually protects you? We've started to see more cases, but I'm going to tell you, too, and I hate to say this, brother, but the ones who really stood up for me, and I had actually the vast majority of people in that courtroom, they were actually women. There were women who knew me. There were women who I had helped get through something. And they cheered when that judge deliberated for only 1 minute.
Wow.
Because that tape is just undeniable. You can't.
Yes.
He just said, just stand up, not guilty, and he went through this speech trying to describe the politics of decisions and things like that. But I said, at the end of the day, everybody knew what it was. And if you were sitting in there, and I noticed that the assailant wouldn't bring a lot of people in. I think part of that was planned. She didn't want them to really hear at that point because, see, in DV court and others, you can get away with lying and not giving someone the whole tape. You don't have a right to discovery there, which we need to change, right? But when you get in that criminal court, you can't hide evidence, or if it's found that you did. And in our case, she did too, because we already had evidence, which we talked about in court, where they had actually even tried to splice the tape. Because part of what was played in one hearing wasn't even on the full version. I said, well, how is that possible? So they really went through a lot of lengths to do this. And that's the other thing I will say. Subpoena everything. You'll have lawyers who are lazy out there.
Mm-hmm.
Subpoena everything. Find some way, find some resource. I don't care what it is, but subpoena everything, because end of the day, if we would have, if we would have just had the tape and just subpoenaed anything or just put a blanket statement, subpoena any tape, anything related to this actually never goes that far.
Yeah.
And I still, to this day have people who approach me about suing both the police department, court systems, obviously the assailant, which is the most difficult for me because of the asset that I have that resides with my child. So that's always a difficult thing.
No, listen, I think your story is an important one. And I think there's countless other stories. And unfortunately, we don't get to see, experience, and don't have the sort of ending that yours has. But before we get out of here, I really want to talk about some of the work that you're currently doing in your area and how you're working really hard to help your community.
Well, I actually run We Build Concord, which is the largest affordable housing developer in Cabarrus County. This is right outside of Charlotte, actually. And the work I'm doing now is about putting low to moderate wage workers, seniors, returning citizens into homes that they can afford. It only represents 30% of their income. And 70% of the units that we create are for ownership, because we realize that's so important to stability of neighborhoods. And so I'm very fortunate to be doing that. But I actually align it a lot with workforce development, economic development, so that people get access to those from where they live. And I think that that's important. I don't believe in trying to resegregate. I try to actually get them in the areas where their values also increase, but they also now have a sense of their own community. And I think that's important, man. Harvard just released a study that for the first time in our history, 50% of renters, for example, are cost burdened, meaning they're spending way over 30% of their income on housing alone. We have a model where we stop that, but also a model where we promote ownership, and along with some affordable rentals to help people who need to go through stages before they're ready for ownership. So I'm very happy with that, been able to actually get a lot of people employed that way as well. 76% of our contractors are minority or women. So one of the highest rates in the state. And that's intentional. We have to be intentional about recruitment, other things. So when we talk about, again, this notion of equity, right? It's a tool. At the end of the day, too, what I want justice, I want the result.
Yeah, and that leads me to another question. But how important is equity in housing? Addressing the needs of the underhoused, in terms of allowing them to be in a position to take advantage of opportunities that this country provides. How important is it to provide housing to help solve some of our poverty problems?
I mean, one, it's very important because it has one of the largest impacts on our talent development, our pipeline, which is going to be more and more diverse. By year 2044, majority of America will be Black or brown. The reality is that generation is already born.
Yes.
So they're already here among us. And what we have to do, and the reason that it's important, is because housing dictates where you live, your proximity to jobs, your proximity to economic development, proximity to the right education. And so it actually is not just about wealth creation and stability, but it's really about our talent pipeline. And I'll just leave you with just one brief, quick history, man. In 1990, we ranked 6th in the world, America, in education and health. But what we did was we gutted during the 90s all of our civil rights gains when it came to desegregation. So desegregation laws, we gutted them. We also then didn't put money into career technical education, but back then we called trades, right? And we took away the arts. Then we came up with welfare reform that didn't allow women to actually use some of their clock towards really getting the type of certifications and education they needed. And of course, we had the crime bill where we just locked up nonviolent criminals at high rates. And so we segregated our whole our whole talent pipeline based off of not just race and class, but actually housing patterns and education. That by the mid 2000s, we ranked 27th. So there's solid evidence that if we actually focus more on talent development and have housing as part of the solution, we actually have a better America.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing. That's amazing. Before we get out of here, how can we find you if people want to support the work you're doing or just find out about what you're doing or participate?
Sure. Well, you can always reach me on Instagram at Dr. P. Graham. Not hard to find me there, but also info at webuildconcord.org. You hit that email, you'll find me very quickly. They'll forward me, and I'll definitely be in contact with whoever reaches out to me.
I love it. And I, for one, want to thank you for your story and sharing it to our audience and joining us today. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you, I thank you for having me, but I thank you for all you've done, man, throughout your life. And it's good that they have an equity and justice fighter here moderating such a panel because conversations, because you actually understand what it means. And I think that's important. So thank you, brother, for all you've done.
No, I appreciate it. And that wraps up another compelling episode of Equity in Focus. I'm Kevin Hooks, and we've been in conversation with the inspiring Dr. Patrick Graham. He's a man whose life's work served as a beacon of hope and justice to all our communities. Patrick, your dedication to creating change and uplifting the voiceless has left an indelible mark on our hearts and our minds. And to our listeners, may today's discussion fuel your passion for equity and prompt you to take action in your own corners of the world. And remember, the journey toward justice is long, but each step we take makes a difference. Thank you all for tuning in. And until next time, keep your focus sharp and your spirit unbreakable.